Here's part 2 of my Metroidvania Mania review series. Without needlessly stretching this intro on longer than necessary, let's begin. The time jump between Blind Forest and Will o' the Wisps isn't significant, as it takes place shortly after the events of the previous entry. Ori now has an adopted sister by the name of Ku, I believe that's how you pronounce it, who is not only the daughter of the previous game's big bad Kiro, yeah, I definitely didn't pronounce that correctly, but then again, what else is new, but is just as adorable as Ori. Hard to imagine, I know. Will o' the Wisps is like Blind Forest, where instead of using walls of dialogue that stretch on for as long as the Burj Khalifa as a driving point for its narrative, its story is shown through actions. Will o' the Wisps focuses more on the relationship between Ori and Ku, instead of the one between Ori and extra thick, with 10 sides of bacon mother figure Naru. Ku is unable to fly at first, which is probably like having a dysfunctional dick. All flap and no substance. And if a thing you have that's supposed to work doesn't work, obviously it's gonna make you sad. So Ori comes up with a way to make her fly, where the two then go for a test flight. During this test flight, a storm causes them to be separated, where they wind up in a brand new region. Ori must explore this new land if it wants to be reunited with Ku. I say it because Ori is genderless. So it's kinda like Venom, except much cuter. And not an asshole. What follows is, in my opinion, a much more emotionally charged, darker story with way more supporting characters, many of which you'll grow to love, then watch them die slowly and painfully. Will o' the Wisps, much like Blind Forest, also has an owl for a villain, except her name is Shriek, and her backstory is different from Kiro's. Different as in more tragic. I won't say why, but what I will say is you'll definitely feel sorry for Shriek once her backstory is revealed. In the first installment of this series, I said that Blind Forest yanks at your heartstrings. Will o' the Wisps, on the other hand, shreds them into ribbons, with one of the most emotionally impactful, bittersweet endings I've ever seen in not just gaming, but in general. While it was bittersweet, the ending felt like a perfect conclusion. Will o' the Wisps has a much heavier focus on combat. Luckily, the combat system is a massive improvement over Blind Forest combat, as it's much more refined with its less simplistic approach and better variety of different weapons to choose from. Certain weapons require attack energy, while others don't rely on it at all. The attack energy is no longer used for creating your own save points, seeing how Will o' the Wisps saves automatically. I prefer this as it makes the game a lot less stressful, even though it's still stressful. Although, obviously, this won't be a plus for everyone. Weapon variety isn't the only aspect that's been improved upon. There's also more enemy types, including actual boss fights. The fights themselves are surprisingly good. Bosses involve being chased, then fighting them, or vice versa. These creatures are absolutely massive, taking up a huge chunk of the screen and really putting into perspective how much of a little turd Ori is. The final boss in particular being the best example, as it should be. The sheer amount of epicness from the final battle gives the Ravenbeak fight in Metroid Dread a run for its money. The game still has those memorable, intense chase sequences first seen in Blind Forest, although they're not as difficult. As I said beforehand, the game has a lot more supporting characters, NPCs included. They all have their own charm, ultimately making the world feel more lively. Some NPCs will offer you upgrades for already existing moves and weapons, or brand new moves and weapons altogether, while other NPCs offer side quests. Sadly, most of them boil down to fetch quests and reward you with either skill orbs or Gorlek ore, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, which is only slightly better than nothing. I think rewards from side content should be a little bit more than just, "Here's some money or a piece of rock. Now fuck off!" Will o' the Wisps looks even more beautiful than Blind Forest as it leans more into 2.5 territory and has more varied, vibrant locations that aren't just a bunch of forested areas. And I think the much greater variation between the environments ultimately lended towards an amazing soundtrack being made into something even greater, if you can believe it. There's a lot more branching paths, hidden areas included. You'll uncover more upgrades and collectibles aside from the life and energy upgrades. Gorlek ore is used for repairing objects or moving obstacles out of the way so you can explore the world further. Spirit shards act as combat or traversal perks. Yep, what a totally unique system that has never been used by another game before. Will-o'-the-Wisps is kinda like that kid from school who decided to copy the smart kid's work. There's also combat challenges. When you complete one, you can unlock an additional slot for holding more spirit shards. There's also speedruns, although I did try a speedrun once and I failed in spectacular fashion. Sure, I could have tried again, but in my defense, I didn't want to. Generally, Metroidvanias will give you an idea where power-ups might be, but they don't tell you outright. Unfortunately, Will-o'-the-Wisp's map, much like the previous outing, still shows you where the ancestral trees are, which are always equivalent to Chozo statues. I think it would have been better if you uncovered them yourself, without the trees being visible on the map. Another map-related issue is Will-o'-the-Wisps still has some sections where several keystones are required in order to unlock a door, although this is done to less of an extent than it was in the prequel. One last thing I'll mention is there's something called Quick Access. This lets you repeat chase sequences, or boss fights, with the inclusion of a timer. So you can compete with a bunch of people on a leaderboard for fastest completion time. Except the only people you can compete with are strangers because you have no friends and cry yourself to sleep because of it. Will-o'-the-Wisps does exactly what a sequel should do. Keep all the traits that made the original great, while also vastly improving upon the traits that were much less desirable, and even adding in a bunch of new welcome features. This game gets a 9 out of 10. The narrative of Pirate's Curse boils down to an undead being known as the Pirate Master, who will soon be revived. Shantae must team up with her nemesis, Risky Boots, in order to stop the Pirate Master from making his return. Yeah, the story isn't something that is particularly memorable, nor does it have the same emotional oomph the other two games' stories on this list have. But the writing is humorous, and the characters are all oozing with charm, despite there being very little voice acting. Instead of the world being one giant interconnected space, the playable areas of Pirate's Curse are split up into 6 small islands. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'll take a smaller Metroidvania over one with an overly large map, filled with repetitive themes and pathways any day. The collectibles you'll find throughout the world are mainly heart squids, tinkerbats, which honestly serve no other purpose than obtaining the good ending, gems, and pirate gear. Items that are used for exploring previously inaccessible areas, and sometimes they're even used in combat. I will say though, I appreciate how each island is drastically different with its themes and music. The latter of which is as catchy as a game should be when you're playing as a belly dancing genie. Well, former genie anyway. Scuttletown is the one and only hub area within the game. This is where you can use gems to buy new moves or upgrade already obtained moves and weapons, including the damage and speed of your hair whipping with shampoo or conditioner. Yes, that's actually a thing in this game. Now, if my only means of defending myself could be done with my hair, then my balding ass would be 7 kinds of fucked. You can trade 4 heart squids to this woman, she melts them down, permanently increasing the amount of hearts you have. If finding several pieces of a heart sounds familiar, it's because the game takes a lot of inspiration from Zelda. You enter a dungeon, or as they are known in this game, Dens of Evil, unlock doors with keys, fight a mini-boss or two, obtain an item inside a Den of Evil, and use it to defeat the boss lurking within. Beating a dungeon boss doesn't reward you with the typical heart container. Instead, you acquire a map for the next island. I do appreciate all the dungeons having their own distinct themes, although they're not nearly as well designed or memorable as the ones seen in Zelda, obviously. The bosses have something in common with Will-o'-the-Wisps, where they are these massive creatures that take up the entire screen. As a result of the bosses needing to be defeated via item, the fights have the same puzzle approach as Zelda games do, something I actually quite like. The pixel art is good, but not nearly as striking as a lot of other pixelated Metroidvanias. In Pirate Curse's defense though, the game was originally released on the 3DS. While Pirate's Curse is a great game, it has a few problems. One of the pieces of pirate gear you get is a pistol. While I do think it's one of Pirate Curse's best weapons, you can't aim up or down with it. Why, you might ask? Beats the fuck out of me. The next problem is this game has no legitimate fast travel option. There's something called a pirate flare that allows you to return to Risky's ship, but even then, I'm not completely satisfied with how fast travel was handled, seeing how pirate flares are limited. There's also an annoying fetch quest in the form of making sketches from these coffins, so you use the sketches to decipher a code that, when you put it in correctly, will unlock a door on the third island. It's annoying because not all these coffins are on the third island, like they should be. Backtracking in a Metroidvania is a given, but this isn't the way to go about it. When you beat the game, you unlock something called Pirate Mode. It's basically New Game Plus, where it allows you to keep all the pirate gear you obtained in your first playthrough and use it to complete speedruns. My final score for Pirate's Curse is 8 out of 10. Metroidvanias usually don't focus heavily on the narrative, as the world itself tells a story. But Iconoclast does in fact have a heavy focus on its story, and it's a really compelling one. Iconoclasts centers around a practically mute 17-year-old mechanic by the name of Robin, who comes into conflict with the One Concern, a powerful organization with a cult-like mentality that governs the planet and worships the beings known as him and Mother. Yeah, I know, sounds super creepy. After they find out she is an unlicensed mechanic working in secret rather than one employed by them, which is strictly forbidden and is met with penance. What that basically means is they'll kill you dead. You see how the One Concern has taken its toll on the inhabitants of the world, including Robin herself, her older brother, and the friends she makes along the way. So much so, they have strained relationships with their families. All the major characters have their own distinct personalities and are written so well. They actually feel like real people struggling to get by in this harsh world. Even the villains have so much character to them. Most of the villains are these individuals called agents who are superhumans with cybernetic implants. They serve as the enforcers of the One Concern, with Agent Black being the standout for me. She's like a Terminator in the sense where she's cold, efficient, and extremely prone to showing you those hands. Except, unlike a Terminator, she is prone to getting headaches and has a temper shorter than Tiny Cruz. This game has a heavy focus on boss fights. There's over 20 actually, with some of them being optional. The fights themselves have a lot of variety. One boss sees you teaming up with Robin's friend Mina. The boss's weak point will change locations throughout the fight, forcing you to switch between Robin and Mina depending on whose side the weak point is actually on. And yes, there are times when you play as a different character, aside from just boss fights. Although they are much more brief than the time you spend playing as Robin, because no duh. Another boss sees you running away from him for the majority of the fight, as he chases you down like the Sax from Metroid Fusion did. Unfortunately for Iconoclasts, exploration is severely lacking, as its branching paths are really limited and not as rewarding as a Metroidvania should be. Instead of uncovering health upgrades or power-ups, exploration rewards come in only two forms. The first being resources. These are used for crafting tweaks, and the second being schematics for specific tweaks. Tweaks are kind of like the perks from Hollow Knight or Will-o'-the-Wisps, except you can only equip 3 at a time, with no chance of upgrading how many you can hold in the future. Tools are your main line of defense in this game, your gun being your primary tool. It has multiple different modes, including energy projectiles and bombs. Upon holding down the shooting button, you build up an even more powerful energy projectile, or rocket in the bomb's case. Then, there's your wrench. The wrench is usually used for twisting nuts. No, but in all seriousness, the wrench is kind of like a key, where it helps you unlock doors. Melee combat-wise, it has basic strikes along with a spinning move that deflects projectiles back at enemies. A move I love pulling off, as it makes enemies regret all their life decisions in a split second. Later on in the game, the wrench is modified with electricity, increasing its potency and also granting you the ability to zippity-doo-dah around the environment. This obviously makes traversal more enjoyable. While these tools are undeniably fun to use, Iconoclast doesn't have as many of them as I had hoped. A fairly large portion of the game focuses on solving puzzles. Depending on how you feel about them, this may be a good or bad thing. Personally, I'm not a fan of puzzles, with the exception of the ones in Zelda dungeons, because they're fun, not overly complicated, and don't slow the pacing down to mock snail. On the bright side, the pixel art is fantastic, and the environments are actually really colorful, with an area known as Fairy or Shockwood being the best example of this. Some regions even include hubs. I think it's a nice touch as it makes Iconoclast feel more like a living, breathing world. One huge downside, aside from the linearity, is there is one level in this game that sucks big, fat, sweaty, unwashed giraffe nuts, called the Tower. This level is one giant clusterfuck of confusion. You might as well be wandering around in the dark like a headless chicken. Your goal is looking for keys to progress forward, except you more often than not wind up at a dead end or location you have already visited. Yep, lots of fun. The creator did a lot of good with this game, but this section can fuck itself with icy hot cream as lube. Despite having a dark story and taking place in what I'm assuming is a post-apocalyptic landscape, the soundtrack is usually upbeat and catchy. As for fast travel, it is in the game. Unfortunately though, you don't unlock it until fairly later on. Another thing you can't unlock until later on, or in this example's case, way later on, is the double jump, as it's locked behind a side quest involving an optional boss fight. This might just be me, but I think the double jump should always be a mandatory upgrade in a Metroidvania. Side quests themselves reward you with schematics for making new tweaks, which is better than being rewarded with money. Much like Metroid Dread, when you beat Iconoclast, you unlock Boss Rush mode and an even more difficult mode if you fancy needless suffering. Filthy masochist. My final score for Iconoclast is an 8.5 out of 10. Alrighty, that'll do it for this video. I'll be sure to post more often in the future because honestly, I do enjoy making these videos and I am glad that people are watching them and enjoying them, and I hope I make people laugh or just brighten up their days if they feel like shite, because I am all too familiar with that. So yeah, anyways, peace out. Haha, bitch! Thank you.